Thanks, everybody, for joining us. I am Jeff Smith. In 2003, the book and later the movie, The Corporation, came out with a clear take on corporate personhood. Its essential argument was if corporations are people, they might fit the definition of a psychopath. In 2020, a follow-up was published, The New Corporation, How Good Corporations Can Threaten Democracy. That details how corporations now are impacting the global economy. Joining us today to talk about how new capitalism is impacting democracy is, in fact, author Joel Bakan. Joel, thank you so much for being with us.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So first of all, thanks again. I know the initial emails sent to you to have this conversation were sent almost exactly a year ago. In fact, a little more than a year ago, just before the COVID pandemic struck, impacting everything, including conversations like this. The new book, what's new?
Well, a lot is new. I got the idea to write a new book and to make a new film, actually, while Obama was still in the White House, before Trump was elected. A lot of people think, oh, you must have had this idea once Trump was elected. But I was actually watching the 10th anniversary screening of my first film, and I realized we were having a big celebration. We'd rented a theater. We had a lot of booze, stuff like that. And I realized it's really nothing to celebrate here. I mean, everything we talked about in the first film has gotten worse. But what's changed as well is while everything's gotten worse, corporations have said they're getting better. Like around 2005, they really started to say, you know what, we understand that we've been bad. You know, we've even been like psychopaths, but we're going to be better now. We're going to be sustainable. We're going to embed corporate responsibility at the very core of our operations. We're going to do all this stuff. And what I've realized and what I learned and what I've put into the film and book, the central argument is this is a play for power. What corporations are saying is we're good now. So let us run your society. Let us run your schools. Let us run your water systems. We don't need to be regulated anymore because we're good now and we can be good voluntarily. So that's the chilling thing.
So what's new is marketing? Is what's new a certain corporate practice? Is it a recognition that as maybe with Occupy, maybe with your book, maybe with the biggest wealth disparities since the Gilded Age, there is a recognition of some of the social impacts of the last 40 years of the American economy, and the response by corporations is to adapt? First of all, do I have that part of the story right? How would you say, let's start with that motivation of why the corporation is new, and then get into what is in fact new, if anything.
Right. So, I mean, if you go back to around 2005, that's when you start seeing corporations saying, we are different now, we are new. It's a direct response to the anti-globalization movements. People had been in the streets in the hundreds of thousands across the world, the Battle of Seattle, all of that stuff. Then you have the 2008 crisis. So, you know, they start saying we're good. Then after 2008, they say, oh, no, you know, we've got to make it better now. And so they double down on all these commitments to sustainability, to values, to equality, to human rights, to the environment, to Black Lives Matter. They're doing all of that. But at the same time, what isn't new is that their primary obligation is to their shareholders. It's to make money for their shareholders. And so while they're purporting to change and while they're doing some nice stuff on the surface, underneath they remain the same. And at the same time, they're also suggesting that because we're the good guys now, we will solve the problems of the world. We shouldn't be seen as the problem anymore. We should be seen as the solution.
And I want to dig into that. I still don't want to get back to how you opened up, which is this idea of having a party, having a celebration for your work. And I can imagine any number, you know, somebody who, you know, the people who I've met, one of the early founders of Earth Day, right? And you have a celebration. Hey, we founded Earth Day, and the climate is under much greater risk, or at least much greater negative impact than it was in the dawn of Earth Day, right? So is that a celebration? Is it a wake? You got to make sure people can still dance at their revolution. But yeah, how do you capture that mood? Does it go back and forth? It's a moment of kinship and celebration and then reflection, then go do some more work. How do you think about it?
I think in the world of criticizing corporate power, it's really, to some extent, it's tilting at windmills. It's David and Goliath. You can come up with all these different metaphors. The thing that I've realized as an academic is that there has to be some fun and some energy in it, which is why I make films, which is why I don't always only write learned scholarly papers. I do that, but there also has to be inspiration, there has to be hope, there has to be fun. So we're in this odd position where we do have to be celebrating the victories. It was a real celebration that we'd managed to make this film, and it had gone out there and it had influenced people and inspired people for 10 years. But we also have to reckon with what we're up against, and with the fact that while we're throwing things at the wall isn't necessarily moving except further towards us. And so I think that is the place that we have to occupy, as activists, as critics, as people who are going up against an immense power. But I always remain hopeful, and the end of the book and the end of the film are hopeful. But we have to work for that hope.
In the idea of sort of the new corporation, the idea that you put forward 21 years ago is essentially corporations are the problem. Corporations are eating us for their own benefit, and they were designed, to use the language of my own dad, they were built to be perhaps our greatest invention, and now they are the thing that is, the corporations are not working for us. Now we work for the entity, for the corporate form. My corporations law professor had a similar take. Now you say corporations are putting themselves out for the solution. Now, in some respects, if government is hobbled, if there has been an effective job at undermining the idea of democracy, of sort of collective decision-making and problem-solving as something that in fact can solve problems, then in relative terms, corporation might be better. What are examples that are the hardest for you to navigate? What are those that you think, if you were trying to be your most sort of brutally honest about your own work, that you'd concede, oh, corporations do a great job at blank?
I would say corporations do a great job at a lot of things. I would say corporations, the initial genius of the invention of the corporation is that it allowed us to be able to create large pools of capital by taking a little bit of money from a lot of people, namely shareholders. Previous forms like the partnership form couldn't do that. So the whole genius of it was to split the atom of ownership and management and allow thousands, even millions of people to own a company in little pieces, in shares. And that is how you could raise the huge sums of capital to build railroads and steamship lines and factories and all of that. So that corporations do that really well. Corporations also have done a pretty decent job of getting the vaccine out. I'm not sure government would have done a better job. And I would say that corporations are, when you look at the things that they're doing, they are in fact improving their footprint. They are using less stuff, recycling more, using renewables more, and things like that. So all of that is true. And I will concede all of that. But the way I see it is the corporation is kind of like a lawnmower. A lawnmower is super useful for cutting your grass, but you don't want to use it to cut your hair. You don't want to use it to vacuum your living room rug or to make your smoothie in the morning. And you do want to regulate it. You want to make sure it doesn't make too much noise. You want to make sure it doesn't end up cutting swaths through your neighbor's lawn and all of that. So it's a tool. And so if you look piece by piece at different things corporations do, I will concede that some of those things are good and many of them are useful. But the problem is that the tool's gotten out of control and we've become its tool. And that's where the problem lies, that we've lost sight of the fact it's a tool. And we've seen corporations and we've seen markets as no longer being tools, but being the ends that we as tools are supposed to be serving. And so we've got it directly upside down. And we need to turn it back around. We need to see corporations as the tools of democracy, of democratic policy, of the public good and the public will. And to the extent, like lawnmowers, they can serve those things, great. But we have to regulate them, we have to limit what they do, and we have to understand where they do more harm than good and where they need to be limited in order to do good. So that, it's not a terribly radical argument in the end. It's an argument
might feel radical in the year 2021, or anytime after the year 1980.
I mean, I think what's really radical is the idea that our democracy is supposed to be subordinate to these institutions that we actually created and that are designed only to create wealth for their shareholders. It's like a Frankenstein story, and that's bizarre.
What have you learned? Anything since the writing of the first book or the release of the first movie that either cut against some of your assumptions, maybe only amplified, right? Maybe only reconfirmed your pre-existing conclusions or even biases. Anything that's happened over the last 20 years that's disrupted any of your conclusions or biases?
I think I always believed that the folks who work in corporations were decent people. So, and that it was, I mean, I play hockey with some CEOs. It's like some of my best friends are corporate managers. So I've always sort of believed that. And I think that the more that I've sort of walked around in the corporate world, in the book and the film, we visit Davos, the World Economic Forum. And I genuinely believe that for the most part, the people who are trotting out this idea of corporate goodness are decently motivated. They really want to do good in the world, but they tend to be blind, and perhaps willfully blind, to the limits of the institution that they're working in and how far they can go with that. So one thing that's been confirmed for me is that the people are decently good people. The other thing that's been confirmed for me is that the imperatives of the corporation are more powerful in both material and ideological ways than I originally even thought. And that's what this new project reveals. And the third thing, kind of bringing those two things together, that's been confirmed for me, is that the corporate elite really don't believe in democracy anymore. And I'll just give you an anecdote. It's in both the film and the book, but I was in Davos and I was sort of shooting the documentary there. And I came across Richard Edelman. And Richard Edelman is probably one of the world's most influential corporate gurus. He runs a PR firm called Edelman. And he's just kind of the person that corporate leaders look to.
Yeah, I've had a couple different friends. I've had a couple different friends work for Edelman locally.
Or work for Edelman. So there you go. So there's Richard Edelman, and I'm interviewing him. And I'm talking about these themes. And I say to him, so this whole idea of the good corporation is great, but what about democracy when corporations start to enter the spaces that governments have traditionally done? And he said to me this, he said, corporations are now good actors so that they can fill the voids left by government. And then he said this, and it's a direct quote, and it just chilled the shit out of me. He said, I'm not much of a believer in political democracy. I believe in the power. I'm not much of a believer in political citizenship. I believe in the power of the marketplace. And political citizenship is basically democracy. So here's one of the good guys of capitalism trumpeting the idea that corporations are and should be good actors, and saying that because they're good actors, they can fill the voids left by government, and that democracy is something that's in the rearview mirror. Now, so what I realized at that moment, the big revelation was, so this whole new corporation movement, this whole idea of corporate goodness is really a play on the whole of it to replace democratic government, to justify, intense privatization, deregulation, to minimize government and maximize corporate governance of our society. And that was a very scary revelation. I think I'd intuited it, but that was the moment when the penny dropped for me.
And I think I'm citing this correctly. Is it Bebop Gresta, the Italian entrepreneur, making essentially the same argument, right? Where that a democratically elected government having maybe no place in a world where companies can solve society's problems. And I want to get to how you respond to that. Before that, I want to make that case. I mean, right now, and you conceded it without me asking it, millions of lives have been saved because of Moderna and Pfizer, and maybe to a lesser degree Johnson and Johnson, and maybe coming up AstraZeneca. We'll see. I mean, like these for-profit, very profitable organizations that, in significant part because of those profits, can pour a ton of money in research and development, get a vaccine to market faster than anything we've ever seen, and help this not be a human catastrophe to the scale of the Spanish flu. So if Edelman's argument is no, now corporations are the heroes, government's the bad guy, corporations are the heroes, pretty good proof point. I mean, like, I would argue millions of lives saved because of the act of private organizations. What's the response to that, or how is that not just a proof point for Bebop Cresta's or Edelman's argument that the corporation's a good guy?
So, I mean, there are several responses to that. You know, the most obvious is that in the wake of the pandemic, it really was up to governments to step up to the plate, to massively intervene in the economy, to organize distributional networks for the vaccines, which the companies did not do, and to make sure that the vaccine rolled out, as it's doing very well in the United States, less well in my country, in Canada, to provide trillion-dollar bailouts that would deal with the economic problems, to provide, which we did better in Canada, I think, than in the United States, to provide measures that ensured distancing, that ensured mask wearing, that made decisions, sometimes not the best decisions, but trying to make decisions to mobilize collective energy to, should we shut down these kinds of businesses now? Should we leave these ones open? A massive coordination effort that certainly corporations in rolling out the vaccine played a role in. But in terms of the kind of genius of the corporations, let's not forget that most of the basic science that the vaccines are based upon were created in universities, were created often with public funds, at least outside the United States. Most universities, certainly in my country, operate on the basis of taxpayer dollars. So huge, massive public investment to create the knowledge base that enabled those vaccines to be created. So then the companies create the vaccines, and while it's working well in the United States, it's not working at all well in the global South, and it's not working very well in my country, for example, in Canada. We're not getting vaccines. And part of the problem with all of this is that the question is, how much do these companies need to make in terms of profit? Why can't we effectively appropriate, in order to solve a world problem and in order to stop millions of more lives from being lost and millions of more people from being ill, especially in the global South, why do we keep respecting the intellectual property rights of these companies that develop the vaccines? Why don't we turn that into a public good? Corporations can't provide the vaccine for public good, but government can say, you know what? There's a limit to how much profit you can make. I mean, good for you, great. You did the work, you got the thing made, and let's cap your profits at such and such. And then after that, let's get this thing into arms around the world, because we're not going to solve this pandemic problem unless we get it into arms across the whole world. We're not, if we've learned one thing from this, is we can't isolate ourselves in the United States or Canada, not in a world that's globalized where people travel and everything else. So there's an argument for, yes, we've saved millions of lives. We're going to lose many, many more millions of lives in order for corporations like the ones you mentioned to continue to profit endlessly off the intellectual property rights in this vaccine. And doesn't it make sense to say, good for you. You deserve your rewards, you deserve your profits, but you don't necessarily deserve to keep these intellectual property rights and just make endless astronomical profits off of this tragedy, when if we appropriated those property rights, we'd be able to get this thing out across the world a lot faster and save a lot of lives. So it's a story about how, as that lawnmower, as I mentioned, you can use the corporate form to get you as a tool, as an important tool to sort of kickstart the development of this thing. But in order to get you to the point where that's going to work, you needed massive public infrastructure and public investment. And in order to get this problem solved in the end around the world, we need more massive public intervention. The corporations play a role in that, but we've sort of given them the whole thing and said, this is just your domain to make as much money as you possibly can off of. That seems wrong to me as people die.
Because it's so present, it feels so salient. There's obviously a lot in what you said. I want to stick on it just for a moment. And I'm imagining having this conversation with Edelman, which if he's watching, would love to do. That even the example you use, let's be clear, and I should expose some of my own bias, not because my bias is the most important thing to evaluate, but just so that you can understand some portion of it, that it will be made more clear, probably in how I ask the question, that even the intellectual property protections you were mentioning are not a function of the private market. Right, they may be advocated for by the money that pays for the lobbyists to preserve them might be funded by business profits, but it was not a jungle economy that decided, wait, if you invent something, you get to hold on to it for a while and make some money doing that, so that you have the incentive to keep doing that, right?
Exactly. Even
within it, some of what I hope for in this discussion, I don't mean with you, I mean the broader global discussion, is just sort of intellectual honesty. And I find the pharma and bioscience argument interesting because there are so many people within that world who advocate, and I say this to compliment, not to critique, advocate in favor of more NIH funding because they recognize that some basic research is almost never going to be in the interest. It's better for Pfizer to be able to work atop of a lot of that basic research and think about applications for compounds, right? Rather than try to do something that will advocate in favor of NIH funding, that will advocate in favor, in fact, of that you'll see very often, because so much of this just gets tangled up in partisan politics, that you'll see somebody, let's say like the former president, Donald Trump, will advocate for a lower budget for the FDA, where you have people within pharma, you have scientists within pharma saying, no. If you want drugs out faster, have a better budget for the FDA to really look at the drugs and make sure they're faster, because we know that all of the streamlining analysis, all of the studies on what kind of streamlining projects work, they're all like, when you apply more scrutiny, when you apply more eyeballs to actually help somebody through the process, that gets drugs through faster. Now, there are things probably we can do on the regulatory landscape, but even to take it further on this, then one would say, well, what if we got rid of any of that stuff? But even that, one of the reasons all of us have trust, when I go to the pharmacy and I'm willing to take down some Tylenol, one of the reasons I trust it is I know there's going to be some trial lawyer who's going to sue their ass if there's cyanide in it, right? That we are benefited by. This idea that it's only their contraposits feels intellectually dishonest, even in the analysis we too often hear. One of the things that seems so interesting about your new take is this idea that instead of now, the arguments in the 70s and 80s were about public-private partnerships, and now it feels like the argument has gotten a little sharper. Now the argument is, well, no, just screw democracy, screw politics altogether, government sucks. You said among many corporate elites, that argument is now, you hear it more. But don't we hear that also just among the people, whether we want to call them voters or consumers or human beings? Isn't it at least in part reflecting the loss of faith in public structures among regular human beings?
Sure. So the argument I make in my book is, of course, we've lost faith in public structures, because Public structures, democracy has abandoned us. And why has that happened? I mean, public structures have been retreating and retreating, and regulators have been retreating, taxes have been retreating, corporations get lower taxes, so there are fewer revenues to provide social programs. Social programs retreat, corporations step in and privatize. God knows the whole defund the police movement associated with the BLM protests was not just about defunding the police. It was about refunding public services that have been totally gutted. So you ask, how could we have faith in a public infrastructure that has been gutted? And then you have to ask, why has it been gutted? Well, it's been gutted because corporations have been pushing for 40 years to gut it. They have been in there lobbying like dirty shirts, lobbying for deregulation. The 2017 tax cuts of Trump weren't enough. You had corporations went back in and asked for more, lobbying for deregulation, lobbying for a diminishment of the public infrastructure, and then coming out and saying, hey, look, it's not working. Gee, I guess we should take it over. So the solution isn't, to just have government and democracy as it is. The solution is we're at a fork in the road. We can either accept that our public and democratic infrastructure has been gutted and that we have to go in a different direction. And corporations are over there with their siren calls saying, hey, come this way because we've got resources, we have power, we have scope, we can get things done. So let us run your schools and let us run your water systems and your social welfare services and your cities because we can do it better. So, that's one path. And that is the path of the Edelmans and the Davos and all of that. The other path is to say democracy is really badly broken. Part of the reason it's broken, a large part, is because it's been broken by an assault by big business for the last 40 years. We need to fix it. So at the end of my book and film, I try to show some examples of what that might look like. I try to, and the basic argument I make is that democracy is an oxymoron unless it's social democracy. You can't have political democracy sitting on top of radical social inequality and exclusion and all of that. Because what inevitably happens is people get angry, they become fearful, and they legitimately become those things. They lose faith and trust in public institutions. And really, unfortunately, as we've been seeing, they turn on each other. They try to find blame. And that dynamic, I mean, we are witnessing that dynamic in real time with very tragic consequences. So we need to take things back. And there are examples of where that's happening. And I'm not trying to be Pollyanna. I'm not saying it's going to be easy. I'm not saying it's going to be quick. I am saying, though, we are at a fork in the road. And we either decide to double down on democracy or abandon it, because I think that's where we're at.
I want to get to the examples, but I want to pick up on something you said is this. It's quoted, Brandeis is quoted as having said it. When I look into the source material, I can't find the source where he said it, but the famous quote that has been attributed to him is you can have either vast wealth disparities or you can have democracy. You can't have both, which is essentially the case, whether he said it or not, essentially the case you were just making. It's a similar trajectory of thought that Larry Lessig went on, a former guest of the show, and if people want to check it out, they can look at the old shows. He started out his thought trajectory is fascinating to me. Right, because he starts out with, and maybe even instructive. He starts out as just a certified smart guy, right? The legend has it that Richard Posner wrote him a recommendation for his Supreme Court clerkship that included a single line. It's the best recommendation I've ever heard. I've written some, and I've received some, and I've read others, and reviewed others. But the best one I've ever heard was apparently, I never read it, of course, but the Richard Posner's recommendation of Larry Lessig, it was simply a single Sentence that said, Lawrence Lessig is the smartest man I've ever met. And it's a great recommendation. But he started as sort of a smart guy, right? And then he goes to Harvard Law School and as a professor, and he works on like technology, right? He's like the ultimate tech bro of law professors. And then he starts moving towards democracy, and he becomes sort of like one of the leading theologians around campaign finance reform. And then, then he starts talking about equality. He's like, really, you can't do any of these things. And I think it was actually the path of a scientist, right? The path of a questioner, somebody who I liken it to Elizabeth Warren's trajectory, right? Who did not start, did not start as some like socialist upriser, right? Started as a Republican and then said, what are we going to do about bankruptcies? And then kept going. It's like, we have a fundamental challenge with the economy right now. And I think people who, if we can get past some of the propaganda, which is what I hope we will also do in this conversation, even as we engage in some of the stuff like the picture right behind me, right, with a like an anti-Trump sign, try to get to where we're after. I should turn that into a question so that this is an interview. But as you think about the trajectory towards equality and towards equality from democracy, you said examples. What examples are you saying that are giving you some hope? Maybe I'm rushing ahead to the hope too quickly, but where are some of that you're seeing that?
Yeah, so in the film and the book, I basically make the argument that democracy has to be, as I've said, it has to be social. It has to be aimed at creating social citizenship, not just political citizenship, at creating some measure of social solidarity. And that, so it has to be quite robust in terms of social programs, in terms of redistribution and all of that. And it also has to encourage people to participate as citizens. And it also has to be responsive to people who are activists in favor of democratic values and planetary values. So I go to a few places in the film and book. I went to Barcelona and did a piece on the mayor there, Ada Colau, who is a very sort of progressive, social movement-oriented politician. I look at Shama Sawant, a city councilor in Seattle, who's a socialist city councilor, and also is the person who started the whole $15 minimum wage movement in the United States. Mayor Lumumba in Jackson, Mississippi. To some extent, Bernie Sanders fits into this model, and the former mayor of Paris. And we look at a lot of people who basically are articulating a model. AOC, AOC is in there, who are articulating a model of democracy that is not willing to accept that democracy should be beholden to corporate power and corporate money, that is willing to accept and champion the notion that government has a substantial role to play in providing the social, the environmental goods that reflect the interests and the will of the people. And a kind of model of social democracy that is about participation of citizens, that's about active citizenship, that's about giving effect to activists in favor of democratic values, all of that. So it's a deepening of democracy, and those are a few examples. There are many more around the world, but I think that's the direction we have to go. It's a very different direction than the kind of neoliberal push of the last 40 years that says, we should be shrinking the role of government in serving public interest and leaving it more to markets and corporations. I do think that the pandemic, and I think Biden's presidency and his policies, even to this point, are an example of this. I think the pandemic has been a real what's the word, stick in the bicycle wheel of neoliberalism. I think a lot of the myths that, government should be small, markets and corporations are good. I think people see that when we're facing these large problems, we need to have ways to act collectively, democratically, through public institutions. We need to have all of that. Sure, corporations and markets can play a role in, as we talked about before, getting the vaccine thing going, making masks, all of that, though they didn't do that very well at the very beginning. There is a role, but there needs to be leadership coming from public, governmental, democratic institutions, as there have been, collective ways to get us out of what are fundamentally collective problems.
I want to lobby you for a moment. I want to find another word other than neoliberal, and I'll say why. I believe that word has gained more purchase, I believe, because I'm a conspiracy theorist, that word has gained more purchase, not because of its occasional use and frequently differentiation of use, or used in lots of different ways. And I don't just mean like, you mean it to sort of describe Hayek, right? But but it was used to describe Al Gore, not to say Al Gore was like Hayek, but to say he's like a new Democrat, right? And I think that what they have in common is it tends to be a word that is used to undermine not just the neo but the liberal, and makes it harder to create a rhetorical architecture that is a left plus center left sort of coalition understanding of the world, where Democrat means evil and liberal means bad, and let's find as many ways as we can get those things to equal bad. It is an aside. I put it in your brain because you're more influential than I am.
No, I'm going to go with your aside and tell you that I even hesitated to use it just now for exactly the reasons you're describing. Yeah. You won't find the word in my book, and you won't find it in the film. Yeah. And I had to do some deft editing in the film because it was used by some of the people we were talking to.
It's become part of the parlance.
It has, and I think it's lazy, including the way I just used it, because what we're really trying to do is talk about people who advocate for market and corporate supremacy, and neoliberal is just a kind of sloppy, lazy, both under-inclusive and over-inclusive way of doing that. So I totally agree with you. It's just easier than the mouthful that you need to try to define what you're saying.
Yeah, and I'll offer one, and I've been dancing with this too. And a law school, not mate, he was a little ahead of me, but a phrase he would use is was market fundamentalist. He even resisted.
Soros came up with that term, George Soros.
Yeah,
it's a good one.
Yeah, and he even resists saying free market, because he's like, where's the free? If what we're talking about is allowing the consolidation of ownership, we're not talking about freedom, right? We're talking about where is the consolidation of ownership useful, and where does it help in being able to solve problems, and where does consolidation of ownership get in the way? And if we can strip ourselves, if we can get behind a Rawlsian veil of ignorance to analyze that question and try to have words that weren't created by Edelman, right, or the anti-Edelman, but just
So let me. I mean, that takes me back to a point you made before, which I was intrigued by, and that is when you said, these intellectual property rights are themselves created by the state, right? In other words, there is no free market, there is no private
as
sector.
Is the corporate form, right? I mean, yeah.
As is the corporate form. The only reason we have corporate capitalism is because of a massive infusion of state power into creating and enforcing property rights, into creating and enforcing contract rights, and into creating and enforcing the corporate form. And I actually wrote a scholarly paper in the Cornell International Law Journal called The Invisible Hand of Law. And it makes that point that the law is all over the place, but we tend to only see it when we're regulating capital, not when we're creating capital. Yeah. And that's the point of the piece. And it's a point that the legal realists made, people like Hale and Morris Cohen and Felix Cohen. Sorry, we're getting a bit.
No, this is good.
Here,
it's not called democracy on the surface, right?
It's called democracy nerds. So this is
exactly no. It's for the 25 people who want to get as nerdy as they can. So let's go. As we can.
So I studied at Harvard with Duncan Kennedy, who was a real.
Duncan Kennedy was a professor of mine. Yeah.
Oh, there you go. And he was a real Robert Hale kind of, acolyte. And Robert Hale understood all this stuff way, way back in the early 20th century, that the law doesn't just regulate markets, it creates markets. And so, when we're talking about the power of corporations and people are saying, oh, get the state out of the economy. Whoa, hold on. If you got the state out of the economy, capital would be totally screwed, because, there would be no basis. They would have no power and they would have nothing. You need the state in the economy to even have a market economy and to have corporations.
This is why, and forgive me, Randall Kennedy and David Kennedy were professors of mine at the law school. Duncan Kennedy was there at the same time, but not my professor. I don't want to cite that wrongly.
Oh, cool. Well, David Kennedy is a dear friend. He's a lovely guy and very bright.
No, he actually gave me a line I still use to help people in various writing circumstances or even various like agenda setting circumstances. He said that the key to a law school exam is finding the hard part. He said, if you want to do well on a law school exam, find the hard part. And I didn't understand what the hell he meant when he said it, but that meant I had to work on it and keep thinking about it for a long time. And now that idea of finding the hard part,
I'm going to tell that to my students.
Yeah, I still cite his line because it's very, very. I found it very useful.
That's a great insight.
Really appreciating and enjoying this conversation. I want to get again deep. I want to think historically. So somebody we haven't talked to yet, Cherny, who wrote The Next Deal. He was speechwriter for Al Gore, the youngest speechwriter until the Not Iron Man author wrote for Obama. He was the youngest speechwriter in White House history, and he was sort of the Clintonian aesthetic. And made a pretty powerful historical case that I cribbed. And essentially, the short version is we had and it's not just his version, but you have the agrarian era that shifts into the industrial age, and in between there you have the progressive era, and now we're moving into an information era, and we need another time of transition. And I found that to be an extraordinarily useful way of understanding American history in a very short way. And but when we look at now what that transition might look like, I think about a friend of mine who retired from Twitter, and he was calling me. He called me while I was at the gym, and he said, "Jeff, you need to understand something that Facebook and Apple and Google and Microsoft and Netflix are more powerful than U.S. Steel and more powerful than Standard Oil and more powerful than Andrew Carnegie 100 years ago." And but a couple of things have changed. One is that within those apparatus, there's still he described it as a mythology that they're just one smart kid in a garage away from being toppled. And when he said Microsoft wouldn't have gotten toppled but for antitrust application of antitrust law, and he said, and the other big difference is that Upton Sinclair could come and write books about what was happening in meatpacking plants. But now the next Upton Sinclair is going to be curated by Facebook and Google algorithms, and whose book is going to be sold on Amazon. When I even just saw the title, The New Corporation, it seemed like it was not only new in its marketing, but new in its expertise. Its expertise was not only in industrialization, its expertise was in organizing human beings to do certain behaviors and think certain thoughts and enjoy certain things. And that expertise has a different kind of application, a different kind of overlap with democracy than did meatpacking plants or the centralization of oil.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a chapter in my book called California (bad) dreaming, and it's all about Silicon Valley and some of what you're talking about. How the power that these companies have is both greater and qualitatively different than anything that we've seen in the past, because it's based ultimately not on providing widgets for us, but on monetizing our thoughts, our culture, all of the sort of soft communicative things that we do, whether it's our intimate relationships or it's our democracy. I'll give you one example of Upton Sinclair's problem, and that is I'm in the same boat. My book is sold on Amazon. I depend on Twitter and Facebook I'll give you a very concrete example. We were long-listed for an Oscar. So we were on the sort of long list, but we weren't shortlisted.
Yeah.
And what happens between the long list and the short list is that filmmakers mount campaigns to try to get people in the Academy to even know about, when you're talking about documentaries, and to vote for their film to get it on the short list, to get it nominated. And these days, those campaigns tend to happen on Twitter. Twitter is kind of the platform for doing that kind of thing. So my producers and the production company tried to run ads on Twitter, and we were rejected. We were told that we were too political. We were told that we were inappropriate. So we didn't get to mount that campaign on Twitter, nor can we use Twitter to publicize the film in order to help us get a distribution deal in the United States or any of that. So this is a real problem. And it's a problem because of the network effects that give these companies their power. There's only Twitter and Facebook, really, in terms of promoting something like we're doing, at any reasonable kind of cost that an independent production like ours can do. You know, we can't put an ad on CNN or MNBC or any of that, but we could do some sort of useful stuff on Twitter, but they have said no to us. They have a monopoly on democratic discourse, basically. And they can say no to Trump, but they can also say no to us. And we are, I would say, trying to promote a democratic agenda. We are trying to enrich democracy with our work. We're trying to create debate in the public square. We're not trying to polarize people. We're not trying to take over Congress like happened on January the 6th. We're not, we're advocating people vote, people get involved in democracy, and Twitter basically banned us from promoting. So to me, that speaks volumes about exactly what we're trying to speak volumes about and what Twitter wouldn't let us speak volumes about.
No, it's even, I even think about the movie theaters who would decide to air your movie, right? Like, and that's an older story, right? That's an older story. But the privatization of public space, if public space is in fact no longer merely the public square, no longer a park that's been allowed to be turned into apartment buildings or shopping malls, but if the public space is information space, the privatization of that space has significant applications or implications on the state of the discourse. How do you navigate that other than like beg Twitter, hope that there's routes around it? I know Eli Pariser argues for a publicly or essentially a public access social network that is more open source, that is not based on profit motive, more like a Wikipedia for Facebook. Where does your mind go next?
Yeah, so where my mind goes is, I tend to be very nerdy about history as well as democracy. And so I go back and I say, okay, well, how did we deal with television and radio when they first came on the scene? Because they're similar in a way. They were dependent on public airwaves, but they were dependent also on private delivery for the most part, and all of the potential foibles and problems with an advertising-driven monetization model. So how did we deal with that? Well, as soon as radio and television came on stream, regulators became involved, and it was immediately understood that these private platforms, for the most part, that were carrying our information, our knowledge, our education, our democratic discourse, that we needed to understand that there was an inherent tension between their private nature and the public nature of what they were doing. And so somehow government needed to step in and craft ways to deal with that. They didn't always do it right. But, the FCC was created. There were restrictions on advertising aimed at children. There are restrictions on various kinds of obscene and whatnot television. There are incentives on sort of public broadcasting, like NPR in the United States. And in every country but the United States, there are nationally funded, and in my case in Canada, both nationally and provincially funded public broadcasters. So government saw this as not to do away with the private dissemination of knowledge, but to think about what needed to be done to ensure that it served rather than undermined the important public values of democracy, education, knowledge, science, and all of that. And so for me, it's really curious that when social media came on stream, we didn't think the same way. But I think part of the reason for that is the historical epoch when this happened. When television came on stream, we were sort of at the height of the post-New Deal world. When radio came on stream, we were in the middle of the New Deal world. So we still had a sense that government did have these roles to play. When social media came on stream, we were in the middle of market fundamentalism, to use that term. There was no sense that government had these important roles to play. And of course, the Googles of the world and all the social and Facebook and Twitter, et cetera, propagated that same view very strongly and continue to. And so through these ideological and historical, for these reasons, we never even had that conversation. It was all about, keeping government out. Government always restricts rather than enables free speech and all of that. So I think we need to have that conversation, since just about all of our democratic knowledge, scientific, all that discourse has now been put onto private platforms, and no longer just sort of in a one-way way, but now discussions among ourselves. We really need to have a discussion as to how to use public power and public resources to make sure that our democracy is protected, and that the public realm, that the marketplace of ideas is appropriately regulated and protected. And the tech industry, of course, says, oh, well, and people say it's impossible to regulate us. We're too national in scope. That's bullshit. There is no technical reason why we can't regulate. It's political. And the political debate is very stultified at the moment. And I think, to me, if January 6th says anything, it's that we've reached a place in our discussions among ourselves that is really dangerous and really problematic. Our town square is super dysfunctional. And in part, we have to blame for that, the fact that our town square has been placed on for-profit private platforms.
What I'm about to say has even made me think about changing the name of the show, because one of the reasons we have it is because, kind of our first principle is that democracy needs to be a first principle. That in the wake of January 6th, there is a more obvious need. It has felt like there's an opportunity for a while that if we're looking for a base shared understanding of what people who have some awareness that other people human beings exist and that we're mildly stronger together than we are apart, if we share anything, even as we cut across political parties to some degree, cut across race and religion to some degree, if we have some shared understanding that building a, 2/3 coalition in the United States who is in favor of democracy. And then we can talk about what that means, or actually wants to be a democratically elected republic. We can argue about what's the best way to do that. But at least if we start with that principle, it feels to me that we have been kind of obvious that we've been resting upon a false consensus, thinking that, well, everybody's still down, so let's just do democracy better. But what we've been seeing, and what I'm hearing from you, is that there's actually been a pretty consistent erosion in that shared consensus, and that refurbishing that shared consensus, or forging it in the first instance to make sure it is a more inclusive shared democracy, shared consensus around democracy, feels to me, again, like the first principle. Maybe we're not democracy nerds, maybe we're democracy theologians or advocates, or, like beggars, hope for-ers. If we share that, what does that refurbishment look like? What does that rebuilding look like? What was refashioning or fashioning a shared consensus around shared decision making? What do you think the pathway to that looks like? Not just I look at history and that means we got to regulate stuff. That means we got to make decisions together and be in on the joke that thinks that it's a good idea for us to make decisions together. How do we get that started?
Well, I think, as I've said, I think the pandemic is in part helping us get it started. I think seeing how a huge collective crisis for us plays out is helping. It certainly wasn't helping on January 6th. So I don't want to get too Pollyanna here.
Yeah.
I think that we share a lot, and I make this argument in my book, as human beings, regardless of our sexuality, our race, our gender, we share a lot in terms of a desire to, as human beings, to live decent lives, to live lives where we have love, to live lives where we have respect, to live lives where we feel we have meaning and purpose, to live lives where we have clean water, to live lives where we have healthcare, where we have nutritional food. And, and I'm not being utopian here. I'm not saying everybody needs to be equal. In fact, we've seen societies where they've tried that, Sovietism, and it didn't work very well. So I'm not looking for any kind of sort of absolute equality. What I am looking for is a world, a country where people don't live in fear all the time, where people do live in hope, where they feel that their kids' futures are at least as good, if not better than their own, where they don't feel that their lives will be destroyed if they get a medical bill because they've had the bad luck to have a medical problem, on and on and on, where they don't feel they're going to go into a grocery store and get gunned down by a shooter. These are things we all have in common. These aren't things that separate us. They're things that unite us. And it feels to me that we've lost our sense. And this is not just on the right, this is on the left, this is among progressives. We've lost our sense that economic equality, class, is a fundamental issue. And it's an issue that actually draws us together, that we have in common, even while we celebrate other differences. So our differences along, race, gender, class, or sexuality, all these things, these are things that are beautiful, that can flourish while we have this common base of a sense of security, of a sense that we can live decent lives and have hope in terms of our material circumstances and education and purpose and all of that. So it's not that complicated when you actually think about what people want and need in their day-to-day lives. And if we can create that kind of social basis, I think that's where social solidarity lies. I don't think we should try to have this melting pot where everybody is the same, which only ends up being white supremacy when we try to do that. I think we need to celebrate our differences, but we need to also celebrate what we have in common. And we need our governments to serve those things. At the moment, we have a world in which, regardless of race, gender, sexuality, whatever, large swaths of the population are feeling excluded, are feeling hopeless, are feeling angry, are feeling fearful. And, what history shows is when that happens, they often turn on each other. And so I think the way to repair things is not just all come together and talk nice and all of that, but it's to instigate social programs. It's to redistribute wealth. It's to have quality education across the board, no matter where you're coming from, what community. Your kid is guaranteed to have as good an education as a kid in the rich neighborhood next to yours. So, that's worked in the past in terms of creating good societies, or even great societies, as Johnson talked about. So, it's not that complicated. How we get from here to there, that's a tricky one.
Right. No, somebody described the housing crisis. We've figured that out before. It's not that it's hard, not that it's complicated, but that it isn't easy. It is, in some respects, simple, but not easy. And this is, frankly, I'll say, this is where my patriotism lives. This is where where I root for national pride. And I am going to put this in the form of a question, that I hope that we can build our national pride around, we can build our patriotism around doing something that, if not brand new and entirely novel, at least pretty rare, special, and sort of future thinking. And here's the question. Are there historical analogs of nations or nation states, whatever, with robust middle classes, with some degree, right, not of, at least of equality of opportunity, some degree of social mobility that we would have some pride in, that were simultaneously as racially diverse, religiously diverse, and aim to be as tolerant as, at our best moments, this nation hopes to be? And the reason I put it in the form of a question is because I can't think of one. And that is to me, therefore, not saying, well, therefore we shouldn't try. No, therefore that's saying that is the historic opportunity, right? That is the way that's where I hope our national pride lives. The reason it's form of a question is because I am a casual student of history, and I now have an excuse to ask someone who has, read things I haven't.
Well, so here's the ironic thing, and I say this as a citizen of the United States. I grew up in East Lansing, Michigan, and moved to Canada when I was in my teens, unwillingly. My family moved here. So I remain a U.S. citizen. I'm also a Canadian citizen. And here's the ironic thing. The ironic thing is that I see the United States as the great inspirer of a vision of society that's written into its constitution, albeit by slave owners and all of that. But the actual ideals of equality, of freedom, of justice, of an independent judiciary, of a separation of powers. I mean, it is an absolutely brilliant experiment. And, despite the really problematic views of the original founders and drafters of the Constitution, what they put down in it, understood through an evolving, not an originalist, but an evolving sort of modern sensibility, is an unbelievably inspiring thing, and inspiring in the world. And I would go a step further to say that many nations, including my current one of residence, have been inspired by it. I mean, in 1982, we created a constitutional Bill of Rights, very much inspired by the US Bill of Rights. And many other countries have gone this route. So I want to give the United States, as a citizen of the US, and feeling the same way that you do as a patriotic citizen of the US, this is where my patriotism is inspired, is in this really incredible experiment that the United States is, and that's inspired everybody else. The ironic thing is that in many ways of the sort of northern global countries that have been inspired by US values and US culture and US constitutionalism, in many ways, the US is the least good at realizing those values today. So when you ask for an example of a country that manages to do these things, I'm going to invoke Canada, not as a perfect example of it, but as an example where, for example, right-wing populism has zero traction in our mainstream politics. Why? Because let's take healthcare. Nobody in Canada goes without healthcare. I mean, we have problems in terms of Indigenous people on reserves, in terms of disparate impacts on people of color. We have all those same problems. But we have a healthcare system where you never even have to think about opening your checkbook or pulling out your credit card. We have an education system that is funded by general revenue rather than property taxes. And what that means is that you can be in the poorest community or the richest community, and you're going to get roughly the same education. So those are just two examples. We have a social welfare system. We have a more robust regulatory system. Not by any means a perfect country. We also pump out some of the worst emissions in the Alberta oil patch. We also have a horrible legacy vis-a-vis Indigenous peoples. We also have police shootings of African Canadians. We have all of that, but we also have a social infrastructure that we also have a tax system that's a lot harder on sort of wealthier people. So we have more redistribution. We have healthcare. We have the education I talked about. We have relatively cheap post-secondary education at elite institutions because they're funded by the government. All of this is subject to corporate pressure, but we're further ahead. We live in the kind of world that ideally AOC and Bernie Sanders would want to create. Freer tuition, all that kind of stuff. Now, is that it's an example of a place that's a further along on the aspirations that I believe are embedded in American constitutionalism. So I believe there are examples, and I believe that you have the sort of constitutional framework to do this, and a history, and I think of the New Deal again, where there has been a lot of energy behind those kinds of ideas.
And the reason I now see so much of see more of the history of the United States through a lens of sort of racial oppression, racial justice than I did previously, and that's a critique of myself rather than otherwise. But that the consensus you're talking about, right? The 20th century kind of even pre-20th century, but the 20th century, roughly speaking, consensus around democracy, the idea that public structures could do good, were required to do good, and did do good, New Deal, Great Society, et cetera, that the decline of that project coincided almost, if not precisely, uncomfortably close to the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the flip of Southern votes towards a different political party. And so that challenge, how like when people will laud Northern Europe and what they have, and I even think of the United States, when the idea of welfare, the idea of me giving something of mine so that someone else can have it, something that I conceive of as mine, right? Although I didn't invent its atoms, right? But I conceive of as mine, and the idea of sharing that with someone else is an easier thing to do the more closely connected I feel to that person. And so this project of how do we have an idea of, sharedness, of shared experience, as we also ramp up in our global understanding of what we share, how do we, as we become, or at least embrace, and also become the more and more diverse nation that we are. And I find that an inspiring project, but I want to at least flag it in our closing minutes. And I almost would like to ask for a part two, because I got specific questions on the book that I still want to ask. But
yeah, sure.
I'm
just sitting in my basement during the pandemic, so you
got time, right?
Time.
But I want to wrap this one with this today, on going back kind of theoretically. If you were the czar of the corporate form, and if we were thinking about, okay, here is where democracy sucks and or it's good, and here's where the corporate form is useful and or sucks. So what we know is that democracy sucks in some ways. I can remember two conversations, one that I had, one that I didn't. One that was with Steve Jobs and Barack Obama, and Steve Jobs sort of threw up in his hands and said, "Oh, this is too slow." After hearing what Obama wanted to do, this is too slow. Like, you'd never be able to get away with this in corporate America. And my response in reading it was, "Yeah, that's democracy. Like, you work in a corporate despotism, which is useful if you want to produce certain things, and if you want other people to be involved in decision making, it's different. Maybe that's a critique of democracy, but anyway, it's slow." So I had a similar one with a guy who was talking to me about something he wanted to do, and I started laying out the steps of what he needed to do, and he threw up his hands and he said, "Well, fine. If you don't want to do it, and if the state doesn't want to do it, that's fine." And I was like, "No, this is what yes sounds like. This is I'm on your side, trying to navigate this." Okay, so democracy can be slow. It can also be dumber, right? If Van Gogh were going to paint something, and if instead you and I and 27 of our randomly selected friends were going to try to do that together, it would look worse than Picasso, right? So that having a central decision maker on certain things makes a lot of sense. So democracy has its challenges. Corporations have their own, from distributive impacts to sort of long-term blind spots, to not being sort of constitutionally capable of thinking about safety nets for those who are not consumers of its products, to information disparities. Where do you see the most important strengths and weaknesses of each form, or maybe even most helpfully, are there any easy guidelines, sort of like, if you were going to put things into buckets, this kind of stuff should go into the democracy bucket, this stuff should go into the corporate form bucket, so that you could start divvying things up, we can make decisions, rather than it just being sort of a tastes great, less filling argument, like yes, democracy, yeah, boo corporations, or vice versa. Where for you the kind of rules of guidelines that give you pragmatic differentiations?
Yeah, so I mean, in the democracy basket, I think has to go our fundamental goals, our aspirations for the future, our collective goals. are decisions about things like how resources are going to be distributed in society, how taxes are going to distribute or redistribute wealth, how far we need to go in regulating to ensure that as a planet we don't burn up and that we don't promote what is usually racial injustice by fouling environment that often people of color live in. There's that whole issue of environmental injustice. So, all those kinds of issues, it's really up to democracy, its institutions, the judiciary, laws to deal with all of those things. I think corporations, in the same way that they created large pools of capital to build railways in Britain and the United States, I think they have a role to play. I'm not a utopianist. I can't think out past 10 years from now, and I don't see a world where we're not going to have markets and corporations. But I do see a world where the democracy basket is potentially, ideally, is the basket where we sort out these difficult problems about how we live together, how we allocate resources, where the lines are between sort of individual freedom and collective good and corporate freedom and collective good. That's democracy, that's the judiciary, that's law, that's the public realm. Important things like education, like water, things that we need, essential things for us. That's democracy. And that's rights and that's law. But again, the corporation is like the lawnmower. It's like the tool that can help us realize those things because of efficiencies, because of economies of scale, because it's good at raising pools of capital, because of all those things. And markets too. I'm not in favor of getting rid of markets. They're a very useful policy tool. So, and we have, Michael Sandel in the film and book basically says the problem isn't that we have markets, it's that we've become a market society. And I would say the same is with corporations. The problem isn't that we have corporations, it's that we've become a corporate society. We need to be a democratic society that has markets and corporations, not a corporate market society. And that's what we become. So that's what the problem is. So I'll go back in closing with to our pal Duncan Kennedy, who talks about the fundamental contradiction. I remember at Harvard, everybody running around the fundamental contradiction. Nobody really understood what he meant by it. But when you read the sort of classic article he wrote, where he talks about it's the fundamental contradiction between our individual aspirations and our collective goals and needs. And we're never going to escape that. That has been the human problem forever. And we're not going to transcend it. And our attempts to truly grapple with it in a way that is just and right and doesn't burn up the planet are going to be messy and they're going to take time. It's like, people who say, we can do it more quickly and more efficiently, just think about your family. Think about your relationships with your romantic partners and your kids. You could easily say in a family, let's just leave it to dad. That's what we did in the 50s, right? That's a lot more efficient and it's less messy than trying to actually take account of all the views in the family and act in ways that are good for everybody and good for the collectivity of the family altogether. It's always easier to go to some father, whether that father figure is Trump or whether it's an actual father or some authoritarian. It's quicker, or some corporate CEO like Steve Jobs. It's quicker, it's easier, it's more efficient. But in going there, we have to give up on democracy, on justice, and potentially on saving the planet from its destruction.
Well, Joel Bakan, the book is The New Corporation: How Good Corporations Are Bad for Democracy. Thank you for chopping it up. Thanks for being part of the lawnmower here today. And as messy as it might have been at times, we really appreciated the conversation. And I do, like the person who finds the genie's lamp, want to wish for more wishes and ask for another chance to chat. Really enjoyed this and appreciate your work.
Thank you so much for having me on. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Be well.
You take care. Bye-bye.